welcome to another painting video. Today I'll be basing and painting my very first Moonstone set. I recently started playing this game and I'm absolutely loving the whimsical vibe of all the models. For this set, I've chosen to paint the hunting horns. I'm really drawn to the fawn models, so I've decided to focus on the Leshavult faction. Get ready because this video will be a little bit longer than usual. I'm using this as a chance to try something a little different from my typical painting style. Since it's a skirmish game, I don't have to worry about painting a whole army, which is nice. I'm using a lot of paints from other companies, so check the bottom graphic, which I'm talking about. Also note that smaller parts like leather and horns I used on all the models. Alright, let's begin, shall we? I want my fawns to look like they're walking through a mystical, eerie forest. To achieve that, I'll be adding lots of texture to the base to really capture that forest feel. After assembling the models and attaching them to the base, I added some 3D printed rocks I had on hand. You could also use cork or other materials that resemble small rocks. These rocks, along with most of the other materials I'm using, are from Epic Basing. Be sure to check them out, they have some amazing basing bits. I picked up a block of coconut fiber from the local pet store and I'm grinding it down to make it finer. You can use a knife or just break it apart with your fingers. This will work perfectly for a forest floor effect. I make sure the fibers are really fine, then mix them with a texture paste. It doesn't really matter which paste you use since we're painting over it anyway. Just mix them together and spread it on the base. While the paste is still drying, I sprinkle on some more ground coconut fiber. I also 3D printed some dead tree branches, again from Epic Basing, and I'm gluing them to the base while the texture paste is still drying. This lets me press the branches into the base, helping them to blend in better. The model of Jayda is super dynamic, so I want to place her on a tree to make it look like she's fleeing while firing behind her. Once again, I'm using dead trees from Epic Basing. I glue the tree to the base and then add more texture paste and coconut fiber. Next, I attach Jayda to the tree in an action pose. To add more texture to the base, I raided my stash of basing materials. First, I glued on some tufts using super glue. I picked the ugliest looking tufts because I'll be painting over them anyways. Then I found some foam moss left over from my Cruel Boys project and added that too. Just apply some PVA glue and sprinkle on the moss. Finally, I finish it off with some static grass. And here you have it, some really interesting looking bases. With all the texture and randomness, they really capture that feel of a forest floor. Alright, let's start painting. I start by priming the models black. I'm using Vallejo black primer, but any black primer will work just fine. Next, I apply an underspray using Dark Plum from Pro Acryl. This helps me create shadows in a purple or burgundy tone. For a zenithal highlight, I spray from above with Dark Ivory, also from Pro Acryl. I avoid using white because I prefer a more muted look for these models. If you're going for more brighter, more vibrant colors, you can opt for a white zenithal highlight instead. Let's start with Hoff's skin, which I want to have a cool gray tone. I begin by base coating with deep gray from The Army Painter. To shade the skin and give the shadows a purple hue, I use Druky Violet. Next, I return with deep gray to paint all the raised areas. For the first highlight, I use uniform gray to build up the gray tones. Then I use ash gray for further highlighting, making the area smaller and smaller to focus the light on the skin. For the next highlight, I introduce some warmth by mixing ash gray with ruby skin. This adds a bit of life to the skin, so it's not just plain gray. And I finish off with a final highlight using ruby skin. I want Hoff to have an overall cold look, so I base coat his jacket with sword-hilt burgundy to maintain the purplish hue throughout the model. To darken the recesses, I shade the jacket with Nuln Oil. For the first layer, I mix sword-hilt burgundy with Kislev Flesh. Kislev Flesh works great as a highlight color. Next, I layer a mix of moldy wine and Kislev Flesh to further build up the colors. And I finish with a final highlight using pure Kislev Flesh. Now, I didn't notice at first, but it looks like Hoff is actually wearing pants, so I base coat them with Steel Legion Drab. Then I shade him with Agrax Earthshade to deepen the recesses. For the next layer, I mix Steel Legion Drab with Light Earth. Finally, I highlight with Light Earth to give Hoff some nice tan leather pants. Now I'm moving on to the black cloth and the hooves. I start with a base coat of Corvus Black. Then I layer on Ashen Grey to add some depth. I mix Ashen Grey with Dawnstone for the first highlight. I follow that with a finer highlight using a 1:2 mix of Ashen Grey and Dawnstone. Finally, I finish with Dawnstone on the sharpest edges for a crisp highlight. In this step, I'm painting the brown leather areas. I start with a base coat of Thondia Brown. Then I layer on Gorthor Brown to build up the color. For highlights, I use Baneblade Brown to pick out the edges and raised areas. Finally, I finish with a wash of Targor Wraithshade to bring a coolness to the leather that fits with the rest of the model. For the bone and horns, I start with a base coat of Leather Brown. Then I layer on Deep Brown on raised areas. Next, I apply Ochre as a mid-tone to brighten the surface and introduce a yellow tint on the horns. For highlights, I use Ushabti Bone to bring out the details. And finally, I finish with a fine highlight of Screaming Skull for those sharp edges and tips. For the hair, I'm going with a rich purplish tone to complement the overall cool muted palette of the color of the model. I start with a base of dark plum. Then I layer on Zerus Purple to bring out the purple tones. For highlights, I mix Zerus Purple with Company Gray, gradually lightening the hair. Finally, I add sharp highlights with Slanesh Gray to really make the strands pop. This purplish hair ties in nicely with the rest of the model's cold, eerie look. Let's tackle some non-metallic metal. I start with a dark base coat using Stegadon Scale Green. Then I block in the highlights with white paint to establish where the light will be the brightest. From there, I'll build up the color gradually, starting with blue horror for the brightest areas. Then, blending in Frisian Grey and Thunderhawk Blue for midtones and deeper shades. Finally, I use Dark Reaper for the darkest recesses, creating a transition from light to dark. Now I like the feathering, sketchy look, so I didn't really glaze on the layers. If you want a more smooth transition, be sure to do that. For the wood, I start with a base coat of Dryad Bark to give it a deep, cool undertone. Next, I layer on Gorthor Brown to add some texture. Finally, I highlight with Karak Stone to bring out the details and give the wood a natural weathered look. I dot the eyes with white paint and use the contrast paint Imperial Fist to give the eyes an eerie yellow shine. Let's move on to the next miniature in the troupe with the coolest name. I start base coating Mr. Toodles Skin with Moonstone Skin, a very aptly named paint. Then I shade with Reichland Fleshshade to darken the edges where the skin meets other parts. I layer on Agate Skin, thin slightly to apply multiple layers until I achieve a smooth finish. Next, I repeat the process using Barbarian Flesh for additional depth. For the final highlight, I use Ruby Skin to bring out the details to create a nice warm looking skin tone. I finish by washing some areas with Berserker Bloodshade, focusing on places where the skin is thin like elbows and knuckles. I start by base coating the fur with Rhinox Hide, a rich dark brown that provides excellent coverage. It's a versatile paint that works well for this base. Next, I lightly dry brush Doombull Brown on the fur. This shade has a redder tone and adds depth to the texture. Finally, I finish with a dry brush of Xandri Dust to create contrast and highlight the fur. I want a fun color for Mr. Toodles' jacket, and I thought a mustardy yellow would be perfect. I start by base coating with deep brown to create a solid foundation for the yellow. Next, I apply ochre as the base yellow color. It covers really well and gives a nice look. I shade with Syrupin Sepia to warm up the edges and add some depths. Then I layer on Dirty Yellow to brighten the jacket and make it stand out a little bit more. For the final highlight, I use Ice Yellow to add a touch of brightness. I paint the stitches on the seam with Doombull Brown and highlight them with Light Earth to add some variation and detail to the jacket. To add some variety to Mr. Toodles, I paint his purse with Doombull Brown as the base. Next, I layer on Wasdaka Red to give it a vibrant red tone. For the final touch, I highlight with Squig Orange to create a stylish red leather look. To keep consistent with the non-metallic metal look, I'm trying non-metallic copper as well. I start by base coating with Rhinox Hide. Next, I highlight the copper using a mix of Rhinox hide and dark warm flesh. I add more dark warm flesh to the mix and highlight again for added depth. Then I gradually layer in a lighter tone by mixing dark warm flesh with white paint. I continue to lighten the mix with more white paint and apply additional layers. And I finish with a final highlight of pure white. I'm pleased with this technique, though I might experiment with other methods in the future and add more warmth to the copper, as the color feels a little flat right now. Jayda is the last of this troupe, but definitely one of my favorites. I want her to have a very light skin, so I start with a base coat of barbarian flesh. Next, I shade with Agrax to deepen the edges and add a cold undertone. I layer on ruby skin, applying several thin layers to ensure an even coat. Then I repeat the previous process with opal skin for a smooth transition. And I finish with a highlight of pearl skin to achieve a very light and fair complexion. Of course, a woodland fawn needs some green clothes. I start by base coating with Death World Forest. Next, I layer on Death Guard green to add more definition to the clothes. I then highlight with Ogren Camo to start bringing out the details. Finally, I use Creek Khaki for the final highlight to give the clothing a camo green look. For a touch of variety, I'm adding some dark green leather accents to her outfit. I start by base coating with Caliban green to set a rich, deep tone. Next, I shade with Nuln Oil, applying it only to the underside of the scabbard. This technique helps to keep the top areas brighter and more vibrant. I then layer on Castellan green to build up the color. Following that, I add Army green to further enhance the depth. Finally, I highlight with Camouflage green to bring out the details and add a crisp, contrasting finish. Let's tackle painting white hair. I start with a base coat of Great Hall Grey to lay down a solid foundation. Next, I shade with Agrax to add depth and bring out the shadows. I layer on Worn Stone to build up the color and create a smooth transition. For the highlights, I use Brain Matter Beige to add some contrast and detail. Finally, I finish with a highlight of Matte White to achieve a crisp, bright white look. To complement the white hair, I want to add some contrasting horns. I start by base coating them with a mix of Leviathan Blue, Griffcharger Grey, and Lamia Medium. This blend creates a solid, rich foundation. For the highlights, I'll use two colors to add depth and dimension. First, I apply Thunderhawk Blue to bring out the midtones. Then, I finish with Phrygian Grey for the final highlights, giving the horns a striking, eye-catching contrast. Now that the models are done, it's time to place them in an eerie, enchanted forest setting. I start by shading all the trees and rocks with Agrax to deepen the shadows and add some atmospheric depth. Next, I highlight with Ash Grey to bring out the texture and details. Then I go over the highlights with company gray to create a very pale, dead look for the trees and rocks. For the base, I use the airbrush to add some color with inks. I start with a light turquoise green, applying it to select spots where small beams of light might filter through the tall trees. The rest of the base is sprayed with turquoise blue to add a darker hue and give everything an eerie glow. Don't worry if you hit the models a bit, that's all part of the effect. I carefully dry brush Baharroth Blue over the different flock and tufts on the base to highlight them. Then I repeat the dry brushing with a mix of Baharroth Blue and white paint for extra brightness and contrast. Finally, I paint the rim of the base with Corvus Black to finish off the look. And here's my first finished troupe for Moonstone. I'm really excited by how these models turned out, and it was a lot of fun focusing on each one. I aim to keep the tutorial compact, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment on the video. I'll be painting more Moonstone troops, and I'll be alternating with my usual Warhammer videos. In my next video, I'll be working on the Wild Things troupe before jumping back to my Iron Jaws. In the meantime, don't forget to check out my Instagram for photos of current projects and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching and see you next time.